Madam First Minister, this is not just an opportunity for official rhetoric on the bilateral ties. I'm afraid this is more about how to enable the Chinese viewers and indeed the loyal viewers of Dialogue to know more about not only the national character of Scottish people, but above all, the appeal of your homeland. Very quickly, can you brief our viewers about the charm, the uniqueness of your homeland?
Well, Scotland is an ancient nation. We're renowned for our beautiful scenery, our welcoming population. Everybody worldwide identifies Scotland with whisky, with tartan, with golf, the game that we gave to the world. Modern Scotland also has world-class infrastructure. We have a highly educated population. In fact, we have more top universities per head of population than almost any other country in the world. We are a good place to do business, and we have all of the attributes of a modern economy. Many of our traditional skills in industries like whisky and textiles are now being adapted to meet the challenges of the modern age. So my message to anybody who wants to know more about Scotland is come and visit us, study in Scotland and invest in Scotland.
I'm convinced that Chinese investors would quickly become mesmerized with your short introduction about your own homeland. However, what will be the adversity and challenges for prospective Chinese investors? For example, in what areas do you expect them to make the investment?
Well, we are a country with a comparative and competitive advantage in a number of areas. Energy, for example, is an area where Scotland is a world leader in oil and gas, where there are already Chinese companies investing, but many of the skills of the oil and gas sector are now increasingly being applied in renewable energy, which is another area where Scotland has world-leading capability. Digital technology would be another area. How we adapt to the challenges of an ageing population through the application of healthcare. Scotland is renowned for some of our healthcare innovations, and we're now applying that to the modern age. Food and drink is an area where we are very successful as well. So there are many of the key growth sectors for the future where Scotland has considerable strengths, and Chinese companies are already active in many of these areas, but we're keen to encourage them to invest even more.
Are you still recovering from the aftershocks of the economic crisis since perhaps 2008? Because you are part of you are not a Eurozone, but you are affected by the poor performance of the EU economic health. So are you ready for the Chinese investment? And do you think you are going to create more jobs as a result of China's economic presence in Scotland?
Well, Scotland's economy is a strongly recovering economy. The financial crash and the recession was very difficult and challenging for the Scottish economy, as it was for the UK and many European economies as well. But over the past couple of years, we've seen employment levels increase and unemployment levels reduce. Scotland now has the lowest unemployment and the highest employment rate of any of the nations that make up the United Kingdom. So there are strong signs of recovery. We've also in Scotland got increasing collaborations between our universities and industry, and that gives us a real advantage because we can task our universities with providing the precise skills that companies need for the future. We can also utilise our small and medium-sized enterprises to find the solutions to some of the challenges that bigger companies face. Scotland's a relatively small country, but that can be used to our great advantage because it's very easy in Scotland to bring people together and make the decisions that are right for our economy. So I would say Scotland is absolutely ready for greater investment by Chinese companies in Scotland. And indeed, I've just been celebrating a number of collaborations between Scottish companies and Chinese companies in exactly some of these areas where the best minds are needed to find the solutions for the future. Scotland's always been an innovative nation. We've always had great ideas, and we continue to have good ideas. Partnering with China can help us develop and implement those ideas.
We have no questions about the charm of Scotland. Look at your image, right? You are a good example and a good representative of the Scottish people. Now, the Chinese concept in the New York Stock Exchange is evaporating, and we are entering into an age of a new normal. If you look at the economic diversity, and our GDP has dropped to the lowest since 2008. Now, what do you think of the risks that you might have along with China's investment? Not all of the Chinese investors are acutely aware of the legal environment of Scotland and indeed the European market here. What would you say to advise the Chinese investors?
Well, firstly, notwithstanding the deceleration in China's economic growth, I should say that many people in Scotland and the United Kingdom and in Europe still look with envy to China at the growth in the Chinese economy. But the challenges of the modern global economy make it all the more important that we collaborate, that we look to share ideas and the ways in which we can develop those ideas, and that's where I think Scotland and China can
excuse me, but American media would rather describe China as a giant with a clay feet.
Well, I will choose my own words rather than use the words of anybody else. But my advice, the question was, my advice to those who want to invest in Scotland is to engage with us and allow us to engage with you. We have a very significant presence of Scottish Development International here in China, looking to engage with Chinese companies and looking to assist Scottish companies that are breaking into the Chinese market. We're having considerable success in doing that, but there's always room to do better. And I think the key point here is that further collaboration and further economic links are to our mutual benefit.
What do you think of the issue of internationalizing the RMB? Because pretty soon the IMF will review the candidacy and the competitiveness of RMB so that it can become one of the major world reserve currencies in the basket of special drawing rights. China does want to be viewed as a major option for the international financial order. Now, do you think the internationalization of our currency, which is well underway or under discussion at this moment, will help very much? And if you look at the establishment of the RMB clearing center in London, Frankfurt, and other capital cities of Europe, this is flourishing. I mean, what do you think of the impact?
Well, if we want to support a global economy with the benefits of a global economy shared right across the world, then we need to make sure the infrastructure to support that global economy is there. So on issues like the internationalisation of currency, and of course these are matters that inspire and will continue to demand careful judgment and decision making.
How strong are existing ties between Scotland and China?
I would characterise ties between Scotland and China as very strong very friendly.
But what about in the area of women's rights? Because before you came here, you talked to the media that the innovation of Scotland not only just comes from energy technologies, affluent resources, also comes from your acute awareness about the protection of women's rights and human rights to a large degree. What message would you bring to the Chinese audience here?
Well, I made a speech this morning specifically on the topic of women's rights, and in that speech I reflected on the Beijing Conference on Women's Rights that was 20 years ago, and I made the point that it's in all of our interests, not just Scotland and China, but every country in the world, to better utilise the productive potential of women. Women make up half of the population, so greater equality for women, I think, is a human right for women. And it was Hillary Clinton who at Beijing made the comment that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights.
She made the remarks back in 1995 when the NGO sessions of the 4th World Women Conference took place in Huairou, and I was there to cover the conference there.
Indeed, and it was a landmark conference, and the action platform from that conference inspired a great deal of progress on the issue of women's rights. For example, in Scotland, it inspired our work to tackle domestic violence. So the point I was making this morning is we've made considerable progress, but there's still a considerable amount of progress that we've got to make, and we can learn from each other. China recognises women's equality in its constitution. Scotland has some world-leading practice right now in terms of the provision of child care. We have significantly reduced the gap between men and women in participation in the labour market. So much of my visit this week is about looking at where we can share expertise and where we can share best practice and where we can cooperate more fully.
But I'm afraid many Chinese women are still in the shadow of male chauvinism. Years after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, and representation of women in the decision-making bodies at the higher level is still very poor. But that's a different issue, and I hope our viewers, particularly those ladies and women, would pay more attention to your encouraging message about the gender equity in politics and the broader participation in social progress with the rapid economic expansion of China in recent years. It seems you are the winner, but Scotland lost the Yes campaign. Is that true?
It's certainly true that Scotland did not vote to become an independent country. But what happened in the wake and during the debate about whether or not Scotland should be independent was a great flowering of Scottish identity in many respects, and the Scottish desire to have our voice heard more strongly and more loudly in the United Kingdom and in the Westminster system of government. So there has been an engagement in politics and democracy in Scotland as a result of the referendum that will make our country stronger in the future. And my party is now much stronger in the House of Commons in Westminster, and that is as a direct result of people in Scotland wanting to have a stronger voice and for Scottish interest to be much higher up the list of priorities in the House of Commons and in the United Kingdom government.
But why a majority of the Scots felt they had been betrayed by political elites with the disappointing outcome of the referendum?
Well, I think there was a feeling in Scotland that, having gone through the debate about whether or not we should be an independent country, albeit we did not vote to become an independent country at that time, although the vote was relatively narrow in that sense, there was a feeling that we still wanted to assert our national interests and assert our desire to be heard more loudly, and that is why 50%, half of the Scottish population, chose to vote for the SNP in the election to the House of Commons. We have in Scotland a wonderful phenomenon at the moment of a population that is informed about politics and decision making, that is educated about the decisions that shape our life and want to increasingly influence those decisions. It's an entirely healthy, vibrant democratic movement.
We are very appreciative of the official rhetoric on why you had that strong driving force behind the Yes campaign. Now, in our review of what happened in this independence referendum, one of the major issues, I'm afraid, is purely a retrospective view. Did you want to choose to remain in the British sterling currency, or you'd rather become part of the Eurozone? Because that has a lot to do with perhaps a common desire to be shared by electorate in other parts of Europe.
Well, in the referendum campaign, my party argued that if Scotland chose to be independent, then we should continue to share the pound sterling as a joint currency.
It was ruthlessly rejected by number 10 of Downing Street, I'm afraid.
I suspect, and you will be right to tell me that I cannot prove to you what I'm about to say because of how circumstances develop, but I suspect that if Scotland had voted to become independent, the attitude of Downing Street would have changed very quickly, because at the heart of the proposition that we put forward was the fact that continuing to share a currency for Scotland and England, whose economies are very closely interlinked. Economists describe us as the optimal currency area, then the attitude of Downing Street would have changed quickly, because it would also have been in the benefit of people in England to continue to share a currency with a very important trading partner. You know, Scotland and England trade together, and it would have been in nobody's interest to have to do that in separate currencies.
Now that you have won 56 out of 59 seats in Westminster, and the Prime Minister David Cameron said he would do what he can to live up to the expectations of the Scots following the Yes Scotland, the independence of referendum, What would London do to make you feel happy? And since you've got absolute majority in Westminster at the cost of Labour Party, and what would be the implications of your renewed assertiveness in the Parliament?
Principally, at the moment, we're seeking to persuade the Prime Minister and the United Kingdom government to give Scotland and the Scottish Parliament more autonomy. There is enormous appetite in Scotland for our own Parliament in Edinburgh to have greater economic and social powers. Now, as yet, the United Kingdom government is being resistant to devolving, as we describe it, to Scotland, the range of powers that we would want to see. But hopefully over the period of months that lie ahead, we can persuade the United Kingdom government to go further. In many ways, the United Kingdom government has a choice to make in how it responds to the election victory of the SNP. It can behave as if nothing has changed, and people may conclude that the Westminster system of government is incapable of reforming to meet Scotland's interests, or the Westminster government can choose to respond more positively and persuade people in Scotland that their voice is heard.
What does the greater autonomy of Scotland mean actually on the issue of immigration? Because that has a lot to do with the future of Britain regarding continental Europe. And Chancellor Angela Merkel said, you cannot take it both ways. You want to become a major power in European Union, but you don't want to share the burdens of immigration following the Schengen Agreement. Now, do you think you're going to reject more quota for immigrants from Central Eastern Europe or from North Africa, former British colonies?
Immigration is not one of the powers that is currently proposed to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. There are very good arguments why aspects of immigration policy would lie better with the Scottish Government. I can think of one example around the ability of international students to stay in Scotland and to work and to contribute to Scotland after they graduate. But the Scottish Government, generally speaking, is positive about the contribution that migrants from other countries make to the Scottish economy, and we don't always agree with the United Kingdom government on matters of immigration. All countries have to make sure that their immigration policies are appropriate to the needs of their economies, but Scotland has benefited down the generations from people who have chosen to come and live in Scotland, just as people in Scotland have chosen to go to countries across the world and make a contribution there. And people who come to Scotland to work make a contribution to our economy that far outstrips the cost through benefits and through our health service of having these people live in Scotland. So we are generally, as a government, positive about the contribution that immigration makes to our economy and to our society.
Do you have a strong single voice in the European Parliament on the sensitive issue of immigration? Look at how many people drowned in the Mediterranean when they tried desperately to cross the vast ocean and reach the shore of Italy in particular.
The Scottish Government has been arguing that the United Kingdom Government and the European Union should have a much more comprehensive approach to dealing with the issue of refugees coming across the Mediterranean to seek asylum in Europe. Now, some European countries have had involvement in one way or another down the years in terms of creating some of the conditions that underlie the reason why so many people want to leave these countries, and we have an obligation, a moral obligation, to try to deal with that. It's not acceptable for the European Union or for the United Kingdom or any other country simply to turn our gaze away while people, including children, drown in the Mediterranean. So we've been strong advocates for the United Kingdom and the European Union showing leadership on this issue.
Are you confident about the future of the European Union? I raise this question in the context of not only the devastating financial crisis in Eurozone, but also crisis in Ukraine. Years after the end of the Cold War in 1991, it seems the transatlantic relationship is more fragile than it was. The European powers cannot reach their consensus with regard to how to deal with Putin.
Well, the European Union has to demonstrate that it is capable of responding to the challenges it faces, whether that's the economic and debt crisis in Greece or the crisis in Ukraine. And the European Union, if it is to remain relevant and to remain a significant voice in the future, has to demonstrate that it's able to deal appropriately with these challenges. But the biggest issue and the biggest concern, I suppose, I have about the future of the European Union over the next perhaps 2 years is the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union. At some point over the next 2 years there will be a referendum in the United Kingdom about whether or not the UK should remain a member of the EU. Now my view is that the European Union has got to reform and has got to show itself able to deal perhaps more effectively with these big challenges that it faces. But nevertheless, it is in Scotland's interest, and I think it's in the United Kingdom's interest, to remain an active contributing member to the European Union. So in the referendum that the United Kingdom will have over the next couple of years, I and the SNP and the Scottish Government will be very strong advocates of the United Kingdom retaining our membership. And that's important for economic and social and cultural reasons, but it's very important in terms of our relationship with countries like China and indeed with countries like the United States, because if I look at the companies that choose to invest in Scotland, our membership of the European single market will perhaps not be the only factor behind their decision, but will certainly be a factor behind their decision, and it's therefore important that we retain those benefits.
I'd like to have your comments on the following issues. First of all, given the disputes between France and Germany on the issue of a bailout package for Greece, Ukraine crisis, and the difficulty with which you cannot build a consensus about the asylum seekers, European Union has been left marginalized with the end of the Cold War. You have lost the common enemy facing both the United States and the European Union across the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore you want to join AIIB. You want to be part of the opportunities in the Euro-Asian continent, despite the strong opposition from the United States.
Absolutely. I don't see these choices as being mutually exclusive. Scotland's place in Europe is very important, but increasingly we want to take advantage of strengthening and deepening partnerships with other parts of the world as well. We have considerable strength and expertise in infrastructure development with many companies that specialise in infrastructure development. So when you mention the investment bank, that is an area where Scotland, one of many areas where Scotland will be a willing partner with China and with other countries. So these are not issues that we have to choose between, whether we cooperate with our European partners or seek to forge better relationships with countries elsewhere. These are both important objectives.
With the growing financial integration scheme between European partners and China with regard to AIIB on infrastructure investment, are you confident and convinced that the governance of this multilateral financial institution will be improved? Because that's the major concern of your American friends, right?
Well, absolutely, and America will have to take its own decisions in these regards, and the United Kingdom, and because it will be the United Kingdom rather than the Scottish Government that decides the overall direction for the UK in this respect. Governance of, and I think we see some of the importance of this coming through what we've just been talking about in terms of the European Union's ability to respond to the Greek debt crisis. Governance arrangements, the robustness and the solidity, but also the flexibility of governance arrangements are vitally important. So in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, just as in any other international financial institution, getting the governance arrangements right is fundamentally important.
The European Union is getting crippled and weakened in a way because this continental Europe is increasingly dominated by Germans, the German economy. It's the powerhouse of the European economy, and Greece, for example, sees itself as the German colony in a Germany-dominated continent. What do you think of their complaints?
Well, I think if the European Union is going to continue to prosper and be successful, then it has to recognise and respond to challenges in a way that does recognise that it is a union of many different countries, of many different sizes, of many different economic circumstances. One of the reasons, it's not the only reason, it's perhaps not the most important reason, but one of the reasons I hope that the United Kingdom doesn't just remain a member of the European Union, but becomes a more active and contributing and perhaps constructive member of the European Union in the future, is so that we can bring influence to bear on how the European Union responds to some of these challenges. With any institution or set of institutions like the European Union, there has to be compromises and accommodations in order that countries can cohabit in the way that they've chosen to do. With the Greek debt crisis, compromise was always going to be important. No country can simply walk away from its obligations, but Greece also has to be given the ability to lift its economy out of the difficulties it's faced, to grow its economy, and it's very clear that continued austerity without any prospect of debt restructuring was not going to enable Greece to do that. So often compromise in these situations is very important, and I think the European Union, as it develops over the years to come, has to recognise and demonstrate the responsiveness and the flexibility to deal with emerging challenges, because inevitably we're talking now about Greece and Ukraine. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the big challenges that the European Union will face will be ones that we haven't yet thought of or focused upon. So that flexibility and responsiveness and demonstrating an ability to cope with these challenges is very important.
We understand very well your desire to share power with France and Germany in European Union. In fact, the rest of the world tries to figure out what's going to happen to the process of the European regional integration. Thank you very much for being part of a dialogue. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.